She pressed her palm flat against the slat of the nearest crate and held it there. The wood was cold. March in Holmes County was still cold, a dry cold that came off the fields without apology, and the crates had been sitting behind the receiving shed since at least the night before, maybe longer. She had not meant to touch the crate at all. She had come for an egg flat she had left the previous Thursday, a wooden flat that belonged to her, and she had been walking past the crates toward the side door of the auction shed when she heard it. Not a wheeze. Not the hollow scrape of a bird, too far gone to manage more than that. A trill. Low, sustained, coming from somewhere in the middle of the nearest stack. The sound a pullet makes when she is not comfortable, but has not yet stopped caring about the difference. Ruth Yoder stood still for 3 counts. The trill came again. She set down the flat she had already retrieved. She pressed her palm against the slat. There was warmth inside the crate. Not much. Enough. She read the tag wired to the crate's top corner, handwritten on brown paper torn from a feed bag. $9 for the lot. No returns. Buyer hauls. She looked through the slats. White leghorns, or they had been white once. 20, maybe 25 birds in this crate alone, and their feathering was poor, patchy at the neck and breast, the kind of sparse coat that comes from stress and not from any disease she could name just by looking. They were thin. One bird near the slat sat with her eyes half closed. But not all of them. The one that had trilled was standing. Ruth went inside the shed and found the auction manager. She paid $9 in cash from the small envelope she kept in her coat pocket for auction days. The manager did not ask questions. He looked briefly at the crates and then at Ruth and did not say what he was thinking, which she appreciated. There are parts of a story like this one that most people skip over. The part before anything works. The part where the thing you have decided to try has not yet decided whether it will cooperate, and you are standing in a cold lot holding a receipt for $9 with no particular guarantee attached to it. That part tends to get left out because it is uncomfortable to sit inside. Nothing is resolved there. Nothing is even promising, not really. What is there is only a decision, and the cold and a sound that was just barely not the sound of something giving up. That is where this story starts. It does not start with the eggs. Ruth Yoder was 43 years old. She had been farming her 40 acres outside Farmerstown more or less alone for 6 years. Since the spring, her husband Eli died of a ruptured appendix that had been quietly wrong for 4 days before anyone understood what it was. He was 39. She was 37, and there were 4 children, the youngest of whom was 4, and the oldest 14. And there was a mortgage that was not quite half paid, and a flock of 22 laying hens that had been, until that point, more of a household convenience than a business. She did not fall apart. This is not something she decided. It was simply what happened, or rather what did not happen. In the weeks after the funeral, when she had to decide what the farm would do and what she would do inside it. Her father had died 2 years before Eli, and her mother was in Indiana with her sister's family, and the church district helped the way church districts help, with meals and field work and a deacon who came twice that first month to ask how things stood. Things stood the way things stand when you have lost the other person who was meant to be carrying half the weight. You adjust your footing. You do not put the weight down. She expanded the flock that first winter. 22 hens became 48 by February. 48 became 90 by the following spring. She learned feed store pricing and culling rates, and the difference between a hen that has stopped laying because of season and one that has stopped for good. She learned to track her numbers in a ledger she kept on the kitchen shelf next to the almanac, and she learned that the numbers, kept honestly, were a form of patience. You could look at them when nothing felt certain and they would tell you what was actually true. Her father had taught her to candle eggs when she was 8 years old, holding each one up to the kerosene lantern in the dim of the cellar and turning it slowly, looking for the dark mass that meant something had developed and the clear nothing that meant it had not. He told her then, "Check before you conclude. Don't call it done because it looks dark. Look longer. Use more light. You might be wrong." She had thought of that sentence many times in the 6 years since Eli's death. She had never said it aloud to anyone until she needed to. She had 4 children. Hannah was now 20, and she still lived at home and helped with the flock and the kitchen garden. The other 3, 2 boys and a girl, were out in the district in various stages of their own lives. Ruth did not speak of Eli often. This was not avoidance. It was more that Eli was present in everything she did in a way that made speech redundant. The ledger was his handwriting for the first half of it. She had simply continued from where he stopped. The English neighbor who had a truck was Darrell Ferris, who farmed the parcel to the east and had helped Ruth with heavy hauling 4 or 5 times since Eli died, always for a fair and agreed-upon price. She found him at home and arranged the transport for that afternoon. Darrell did not ask about the crates either, for which she was also grateful. They loaded 4 crates, 300 white leghorn pullets, or near enough. She had done a rough count through the slats, crate by crate, 81, 76, 78, 65, though the last crate was harder to count because the birds were packed more loosely and several were lying down. She wrote the number 300 in the margin of the feed receipt and put it in her pocket. The drive home was 40 minutes. Ruth sat in the truck bed with the crates because she wanted to hear them. The trilling had spread, which she took as a neutral sign. Birds making noise were birds still working to make noise. The one with the half-closed eyes had been in the second crate she'd loaded. She did not try to find it again. There was nothing to be done about one bird in a crate on a moving truck. She had called on Levi Schlabach before leaving. Levi ran the farrowing operation on the farm north of hers, 80 acres, serious hog work, and he kept 3 propane pig brooders in his farrowing shed that he did not use between February and late April. She asked if she could borrow 2. He had come to his fence when she called, looked at her for a moment and said he would want to know what for. She told him. He was quiet in the way a man is quiet when he is deciding whether to say what he is thinking or to say something less direct. Then he said, "From the coal pen? 300? She said yes. He said he would bring the brooders himself, and his tone made clear he would bring them with his opinion attached. She thanked him. She did not engage with the opinion. By the time Darrell's truck turned up her lane, Levi was already in the barn with the 2 propane brooders, and he had turned them on without being asked, which was kind of him, even if the conversation that came with it was not. They got the crates inside. Ruth propped her kerosene lantern on the beam hook and opened the first crate in the warmth of the brooder light, lifting birds out one at a time and setting them on the barn floor. This was the triage. She was looking for birds that could stand and birds that could not, and she was giving each one 30 minutes in the warm space before she made a judgment, because a bird that has been cold and stressed in a crate for an unknown number of hours may look worse than it is. You had to let the warmth do its work first. You had to check before you concluded. Levi watched from the barn door. He did not offer to help, which was fine. His help was the brooders. After 2 hours, the count stood at this: 271 birds, ambulatory, able to stand, drinking from the waterers she'd set out, some already pecking at the scratch she'd spread thin on the floor. 29 birds, non-ambulatory, sitting, unresponsive to the warmth or to the scratch. She left them in a separate corner with their own water access and went to bed. She came back at 4:30 in the morning. It was still dark. She did not need a lantern. She knew the barn. Levi had told his wife that evening, who had mentioned it to someone at the phone shanty, and by the following morning the count that had reached Jonas Troyer at the Farmerstown Farm Supply seed counter was 450 birds, maybe more, from the coal bins, and Ruth Yoder had paid something like $30 for them. Jonas heard this from a man who had heard it from another man who had, at some point, spoken to Levi. Jonas wrote it down on a notepad and then looked at it for a moment and drew a line through it, because Jonas had a habit of trying to track what was actually true. He asked his mother, who knew Ruth and Hannah. His mother said she had heard $309. Jonas Troyer did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Well, which is it?" He was 29, lean with Eli's coloring, which was not uncommon in that family, and he worked the seed counter 5 days a week and kept a quiet ear on the district's agricultural news, the way some people in other occupations keep track of interest rates or weather patterns. He knew the farm supply, its stock, and its prices better than the owner did. He knew what Ruth Yoder's farm produced because she bought her feed from his counter. He marked it in his notepad as 300 birds, $9, status unknown, and moved on. In the barn that same morning, Ruth euthanized 23 of the 29 non-ambulatory birds. She did this before Hannah came down, because there was no reason for both of them to do it. The other 6 had shown some response to warmth and water by 4:30, and she left those in the corner to continue. She worked with the practiced attention of someone who has done this often enough to be neither sentimental about it nor rough. It was the same quality of attention she gave to everything in the barn. She noted the number in her ledger, 23 culled, day 1, remaining 277, 6 uncertain. She wrote the 6 separately with a question mark. The feeding schedule she worked out that first week was based on what she knew of stress recovery in laying hens: higher protein, consistent access to grit and calcium, water kept slightly warm. She measured the temperature under the propane brooders with a thermometer borrowed from the kitchen, 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit at bird level, and she adjusted the propane flow on each unit until it held. She managed the light herself, by hand, opening the barn's south-facing window shutters at the same hour each morning and closing them at the same hour each evening, because consistent light signaling was essential to bringing stress pullets to lay onset, and she was not going to approximate it. She carried a small clock to the barn for this purpose and set it on the feed bin ledge. The 6 uncertain birds, 2 died by day 2. The remaining 4 showed steady improvement. By day 3, she revised the count. 248 birds eating and drinking reliably. That was her real working number. She wrote it in the ledger and drew a line under it. Hannah came to help with the waterers and the feeding each morning, quiet and practical the way Ruth had raised her to be. And on the 3rd morning she looked at the flock and said, "They look better." Ruth said, 23 fewer than we started with. Hannah said, "But the ones that are left." Ruth said yes. The ones that were left looked better. The first full week passed in the particular way that early recovery weeks pass, which is to say nothing dramatic happened, and everything was work. Ruth checked the birds twice daily, morning and evening, and the morning check was longer and more detailed. Each bird assessed for posture and eye clarity, and whether it was eating. She had dealt with suspected respiratory illness in a flock once before, 5 years ago, and she knew what to listen for, and she did not hear it in these birds. What she heard instead was the low collective murmur of a flock adjusting to warmth and space, and consistent food, a sound that after the first 2 days began to sound less like distress and more like complaint, which in a hen is a significant distinction. A complaining hen has expectations. An expectation is a form of health. She kept the count in daily entries, Day 4, 248, eating reliably. Day 5, 248. Day 6, she pulled one bird that had begun to show labored breathing, the kind of wet rattle that she did not want spreading, and she culled it before the evening feeding. Day 7, 247. She did not tell anyone this number. The community gossip version of events had continued to develop independently. At the quilting frolic held on the second Thursday at Miriam Baylor's house, Ruth arrived with her bag and her thimble and sat at the frame and was there for approximately 4 minutes before Miriam said, "I heard you've got quite a project on, Ruth." Ruth said, "I have a flock in recovery, yes." Miriam said, "I heard 340, maybe more, all laying already." Ruth said, 247 birds, none laying. It has been 1 week. Miriam looked at her over the quilt frame. She had a way of looking at people that was not unkind, but suggested she was waiting for the version of the story that would be more satisfying. "None laying," she repeated. Ruth said, "None laying." There was a small silence. Someone else at the frame asked about the cost of feed for that many birds, and Ruth gave the honest number, which produced its own small silence of a different quality, and then the quilting resumed. Miriam did not say anything further about it for the rest of the afternoon, which Ruth took as a form of reassessment. Levi came to see the flock on the 10th day. He came in the morning without calling ahead, which was standard for neighbor visits in the district, and Ruth opened the barn door and let him walk through without narrating anything. She had found that if you let Levi look at something without explaining it, his actual intelligence surfaced instead of his opinion, which was more useful. He walked the length of the barn. He looked at the feeders and the waterers and the propane units. He counted to himself, which she could tell by the slight movement of his lips. He stopped at the far end of the barn and looked at a cluster of birds near the waterer. He said, "That's feather growth." She said, "Started at day 8 or so." He looked at the birds for another moment. New feather growth on a stress-compromised leghorn, beginning at day 8 post-recovery, was the correct thing to see. It meant the birds were putting protein into structure instead of into survival, which was a meaningful distinction. Levi knew this. He had not seen it happen with birds he had written off, but he recognized what it meant. He said, "How many are actually growing back?" She said, 231 showing visible regrowth and normal posture. Another 16 still thin but stable. He said, "And you're feeding all of them?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Ruth, you should think about cutting your losses here. Even if they all pull through, you're 4 weeks from a single egg, maybe more. That's a lot of feed for a maybe." She looked at him. She said, "Check before you conclude." He waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He stood in the barn for another moment and then walked back toward the door. At the door, he turned and said, "Those 2 brooders. You tell me when you're done with them." She said she would. He left. She went back to the feeders. What Levi did not know, because she had not told him and he had not asked precisely, was what she was actually waiting for. It was not a general maybe. She was waiting for a specific thing, which was the moment when 231 stress-recovered leghorn pullets at the edge of point of lay, now warm and fed and no longer fighting for basic function, would do what that breed does when conditions finally become correct. She was not hoping they would lay. She was waiting for the conditions to be met, because she understood that the conditions being met was not a matter of faith. It was a matter of biology. The biology had a schedule, and the schedule required patience. And patience was not the same as hope. She had learned this on this farm. She'd learned it the winter after Eli died, when she had been running numbers in the ledger for the third night in a row, trying to see if the farm could make it through the year, and she had almost concluded that it could not. She'd almost written a figure in the margin that would have meant something she was not ready to decide. She had stopped herself. She had put the pen down and slept, and in the morning she had checked the numbers again with a different quality of attention, the kind her father had meant, and she had found something she had missed in the dark, a calculation that was wrong, a payment that was due to her, not from her, from a timber sale Eli had arranged the previous fall that she had not remembered. $280. It had been enough. Not enough to be comfortable, but enough to get through to spring, which was all enough had ever needed to be. She had checked before she concluded. She had found something still alive inside what looked finished. The third and fourth weeks passed. 247 birds, feeders filled daily. Water checked morning and evening. Light managed by the clock on the feed bin ledge. Shutters opened at the same hour, closed at the same hour. Ruth recorded each day's observations in 1 or 2 lines. Week 3, day 2. All 247 stable. Feed consumption increasing. Good sign. She did not record her expectations because she did not find them useful to record. What was useful was what was true. Hannah asked on the 21st morning while they were filling waters together whether it was working. Ruth said, "Define working." Hannah thought about it. She said, "Are they going to lay?" Ruth said, "Yes." Hannah looked at her. She said, "You know that?" Ruth said, "I know the conditions are met. I know the biology. Yes." Hannah filled the last waterer without saying anything else. She had learned over 20 years that her mother's certainties were not the ordinary kind. They were not the certainties of a person who refused to consider being wrong. They were the certainties of a person who had already done the considering and arrived somewhere. The 23rd morning, Ruth opened the barn at 4:30, the same time she always opened it, and before she reached the feeders, she stopped. There is something you should understand about what a laying flush looks like when it arrives in a flock that has been recovering together. It does not look like progress. It does not look like a promising sign. It does not look like anything gradual or encouraging or incremental. What it looks like is this. You walk into a barn, and the barn is different. Not the smell, not the light, not the sound exactly, but something in all 3 of those things that registers before you have named it. And then you look at the nesting boxes, the long row of them along the east wall that have been empty every morning for 23 mornings, and you see that they are not empty. Ruth stood in the barn doorway for a moment. Then she went to work. She collected eggs for 47 minutes. She carried them to the kitchen table in the flat she had reclaimed from the auction and counted as she set them down, row by row, 12 to a row. When she was done, she stood at the table and looked at what she had. She picked up the pencil from the kitchen shelf and opened the ledger to that day's entry and wrote the number. 187 eggs. First morning. 187 birds in layout of 247 in a single flush on the 23rd day of recovery. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and went to start breakfast. 187 eggs on the 23rd morning became 201 on the 24th, 214 on the 25th. Ruth recorded each number in the ledger in the same pencil, the same hand, 1 line per day, no commentary. The numbers were the commentary. By the end of the 5th week, she had 226 birds in lay. The 16 that had been stable but thin through the recovery period were the last to come in, and they came in slowly, 1 or 2 per day, the way the stragglers in any flock do, not dramatically but steadily, each one a small revision to the running total. She did not celebrate these. She noted them. there is a difference. The feed costs had been real, and she had tracked them without flinching, the way she tracked everything. $47 in the first week when she was feeding a flock that produced nothing. 43 in the second. 39 in the third, when she had adjusted the rations slightly upward in protein to support the feather regrowth she was seeing. The fourth week had been 41, and then the eggs had come, and the arithmetic had changed its character entirely. Hannah had come into the kitchen on that first flush morning to find 187 eggs on the table and her mother making porridge at the stove. She had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the table. Then she said, "How many?" Ruth said, 187. "Write it down if you want. The ledger's open." Hannah wrote it down. She sat at the table for a moment looking at the number in the ledger, the way you look at something that has confirmed what you were told was true, but weren't entirely sure you believed. Then she got up and helped with breakfast, and neither of them said anything else about it, which was the correct response and which Ruth appreciated. The gossip machinery of the district had not stopped turning while the barn was quiet. Jonas Troyer had been tracking what he could from the seed counter, which was not much because Ruth bought feed on a regular schedule, and the schedule had not changed in a way that told him anything he didn't already know. He had heard, through his mother, that Ruth was managing the flock herself, that Hannah was helping, that no veterinarian had been called, and that the 2 propane brooders from Levi Schlabach's farrowing shed were still in Ruth's barn as of the second week. This was a reasonable summary of accurate information, which made it unusual. What was not accurate was the version Miriam Byler had been circulating since the quilting frolic, which had evolved in the 3 weeks since then into a story in which Ruth had purchased the birds for almost nothing and had them laying within days. The detail about days had entered the story somewhere between Miriam's kitchen and the phone shanty, and had not been corrected because Ruth had not been at the phone shanty, and Miriam was not a person who went back and revised a story once it had achieved a satisfying shape. Jonas heard the days version at the seed counter on a Tuesday in the 5th week, from a man who had come in for mineral blocks and wanted to talk. The man said, "I hear those birds Ruth Yoder bought off the coal pen were laying inside a week." Jonas said, 23 days. The man looked at him. He said, "You sure about that?" Jonas said, "She bought feed from this counter. I know her schedule. 23 days to first lay on a stress-compromised flock at point of lay is correct and actually fast. A week would not be biologically possible. The man considered this with the expression of someone who finds the accurate version of a story less interesting than the one he arrived with, but who is also, somewhere underneath that, reassured to know what actually happened. He bought his mineral blocks and left. Jonas made a note. He revised his entry to read, 300 birds, 9. First lay. Day 23, 187, first morning. He looked at it for a moment. He did not draw a line through it this time. By the 6th week, Ruth had 241 birds in lay. The remaining 6 birds in the flock were alive and eating, but had not come into production, and Ruth's working assessment was that they might not, that some percentage of any stressed flock would not recover full function, and that 6 out of 247 was a number she was prepared to accept. She did not cull them. They were eating and otherwise healthy, and feed was not so expensive that she needed to make that decision on their behalf. 241 birds at approximately 89% lay rate in the mornings. She had stopped counting individually by this point because the count had stabilized, and what she was tracking now was not the bird count, but the egg count, which varied day to day in the narrow band that a healthy laying flock at near peak production varies in, up 2, down 3, up 1. a pattern that looked like noise but was in fact the ordinary rhythm of a large flock doing what a large flock does. She was selling eggs from her kitchen door now. She had mentioned it at church and left it at that, and neighbors began arriving on Wednesday and Friday mornings, mostly women, some with their own baskets, some without. And Ruth sold by the dozen at a price she had set by checking the current farm stand rate in the area and pricing 1 cent below it, not as a loss leader, but as a fair price for eggs that had been collected that morning. The neighbors who came to the kitchen door were not making conversation about the birds. They were buying eggs. Ruth was glad of this. Levi Schlabach came for his brooders on a Saturday morning in the 6th week. She had sent word through the phone shanty that she was done with them, and he arrived with his son to collect them. While his son loaded the first brooder onto the wagon, Levi stood in the barn and looked at the flock for a while without speaking. The barn was different from the last time he had seen it. The birds were different. The feathering was nearly complete on all of them, the patchy, sparse coat of the culpen replaced by the dense, close white of a healthy leghorn in lay, and the sound of the barn was the sound of a functioning flock, busy and layered and continuous. He looked at the nesting boxes along the east wall. He said, "How many this morning?" She said, 219. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Eggs." She said, "Yes." 219 eggs that morning. She'd already packed them. They were in the kitchen in 4 flats, waiting. Levi's son came back for the second brooder. Levi helped him lift it, and they loaded it onto the wagon, and Levi climbed up after it. He looked at Ruth from the wagon seat. He said, "Those birds look dead in those crates." She said, "Some of them were." He said most people would have left them. She said, "Most people had." He picked up the lines. He said, "How much feed did you put into them total?" She told him the number. He sat with it for a moment, doing the arithmetic the way farmers always do arithmetic, against price and yield and time. She watched him do it. She could tell when he arrived at the answer because his expression shifted, not to surprise exactly, but to the look of a man recalibrating something he had been certain of. He said, "Well." She said yes. He drove the wagon out. The 4th iteration of the community gossip pattern arrived not through Miriam Byler and not through the phone shanty, but through Jonas Troyer himself. On a Wednesday morning at the farm supply when Levi came in for mineral supplement, Jonas was at the seat counter. Levi came to the back of the store the way he always did and leaned on the counter, and they talked for a moment about nothing consequential, and then Levi said, "You've been keeping track of Ruth Yoder's flock." Jonas said, "I know her feed schedule. Some of it." Levi said, 241 birds in lay, 6 weeks from the coal pen. He did not say it as a question. He said it the way you say a number you have checked and confirmed and are now prepared to stand behind. Jonas looked at him. He wrote it down. 241, 6 weeks. Levi said, "I told her to cut her losses at week 2. Jonas said, "I know. My mother told me." Levi was quiet for a moment. He said, "She said something to me. Check before you conclude." I didn't know what she meant then. Jonas said, "Do you know now?" Levi said, "I know she has 241 birds in lay." He bought his mineral supplement and left. Jonas looked at the note. He read it back to himself once. Then he filed it with the others and went back to work. The 7th week was when Sarah Hirschberger came. Ruth knew Sarah in the way you know people in a district of this size, which is to say she knew her well enough to recognize her wagon from the lane and to have an idea of why she might be coming before she arrived. Sarah ran the egg and dry goods counter at a bulk food store in Millersburg, 6 miles south, and she had been buying 12 dozen eggs from Ruth every week for almost 2 years, reliably in the same quantities. at the same price. She was 38, practical, with the organized efficiency of a person who runs a retail counter where the inventory actually matters. She arrived on a Tuesday morning with her husband beside her on the wagon seat. Ruth saw them from the kitchen window while she was washing the morning's collection jars, and she dried her hands and went to the door. Sarah came in and accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Her husband stayed outside with the wagon, which meant this was a business conversation, and Sarah wanted to conduct it without the extra variable of another person's opinion. She said, "I need to ask you something about your supply." Ruth said, "Go ahead." Sarah said, "I have a restaurant in Millersburg, English place. Been there since before the bypass. They've started a local sourcing program, which means they want eggs from a farm they can name. Same farm every week, consistent quality. They want 60 dozen a week." Ruth said, 60 dozen? Sarah said, "On a standing order. They want to be able to say where the eggs come from, your farm, your name, the county." Ruth said, "You've been buying 12 dozen a week from me for 2 years. Sarah said, "Yes." Ruth said, "What made you come to me for 60? Sarah set her coffee down. She said, "Because your eggs are consistent. Every week, same quality, same size, same shell color. I've had 2 other suppliers in the last 3 years, and both of them had weeks where they couldn't fill the order. You've never had a week where you couldn't fill the order." Ruth looked at her. What Sarah did not know, sitting at the kitchen table, was that there were 300 cull-pen birds in the barn, whose existence was the direct reason Ruth could fill an order of 60 dozen per week. Sarah did not know about the $9 or the crates, or the 23 days, or the 187 eggs on the first morning. She knew only that Ruth's eggs were reliable, because they were, and that reliability had a source, which was the 241 birds in lay at 89% production in the barn, 40 feet from where they were sitting. Ruth considered the offer. She did the arithmetic in her head, which took a moment. 60 dozen per week was 720 eggs per week. Her current daily production was averaging 222 eggs over the past 10 days, which was 1,554 eggs per week, which was 129 dozen and some remainder. 60 dozen per week to Sarah's restaurant was less than half her current production. She could fill the order and still supply her kitchen door neighbors and have eggs left. She said, "Yes." Sarah said, "Yes, you can do it." Ruth said, "Yes, I can do it. And yes, that price works." She had not stated a price. Sarah understood from this that Ruth had done the arithmetic and was working from the current wholesale rate for locally sourced eggs in the county, which was the correct rate and which they were both aware of. Sarah said, "I'll send a driver on Mondays." Ruth said, "Monday mornings, before 9. Sarah said, "Before 9. They shook hands across the kitchen table. Sarah finished her coffee and went back to the wagon, and Ruth heard the wagon turn in the lane and listened to it until it was on the road, and then she went back to the kitchen and wrote the arrangement in the ledger. Standing order. Hirschberger Bulk Foods, Jow Millersburg restaurant account, 60 dozen till week, Monday delivery before 9. She wrote the price. She underlined it once, not for emphasis, but because she underlined standing arrangements. She looked at what she had written. 6 weeks ago, she had paid $9 for 300 birds that the rest of the county had concluded were finished. She had not concluded anything before she checked. She had checked and found warmth where there should have been cold, and had built from there. The 8th week was quieter. The production numbers had settled into their rhythm. Some mornings were 231. Some were 217. The average across the week held between 220 and 225, which was the ordinary variance of a large laying flock in its productive stride. Ruth tracked it daily and weekly and did not try to manage it toward any particular number. It was what it was, and what it was enough. 3 birds died in the 8th week from causes unrelated to the original stress, the ordinary attrition of a large flock, and she noted them without sentiment. The working count of living birds was now 263. She wrote this in the margin of the ledger's weekly summary page with a single notation. 263 alive, 8 weeks. She did not write what she had started with. She knew what she had started with. She did her feet arithmetic for the full 8 weeks one evening at the kitchen table. Not because she needed to, but because she was a person who liked to know the complete number. Feed cost against egg revenue against the $9 at the start, against the cost of the 2 new feeders and waterers she had bought secondhand in week 1. She ran the column twice. She set the pencil down. Hannah came in from outside and saw her at the table with the ledger. She said, "Good or bad?" Ruth said, "Good." Hannah said, "How good?" Ruth said, "Good enough that I should have done it years ago." Hannah sat down across from her. She looked at the ledger but did not turn it to read it, because her mother's financial numbers were her mother's financial numbers, and that was a boundary Ruth had established not through rules, but through the simple fact of never having shared them uninvited. Hannah respected this. She said instead, "Are they going to keep laying at this rate?" Ruth said, "Through fall, yes. Winter will drop the rate. I'll manage the light to keep them producing, but not push them. I want them laying next spring." Hannah said, "You're keeping all of them." Ruth said, 263 birds, yes." She closed the ledger and put it back on the shelf next to the almanac, in the place it had been for 6 years, in the place where Eli's handwriting covered the first 40 pages, and her handwriting covered the next 163. There is a thing that happens in the early morning in a working barn that does not happen at any other time of day. It is not dramatic. It is not the kind of thing anyone would write home about, or describe to a neighbor in a way that would hold their attention for more than a sentence. What it is this. The barn is its own temperature, its own sound, its own weight of air. And when you have been in that barn every morning for 30 years, the way Ruth had been in this barn for 30 years, you know it the way you know the inside of your own hand. You know when it is right, and you know when it is not. And you know both of these things before you have thought about them, before you have named what you are sensing. Ruth went to the barn at 4:30 on a morning in the 8th week. The same time she had been going every morning, and the barn was right. She did not name it. She moved through the feeders, the waterers, the quick visual sweep of the birds, all of it in the order she always did it. And then she came to the nesting boxes along the east wall, the long row of them that had been empty every morning for 23 mornings, and had not been empty since. She pressed her palm flat against the side of the nearest box, and held it there. The wood was warm, not the warmth of a barn in summer, which is a different thing. The warmth of eggs gathered together in a small enclosed space, the heat that living things produce when there are enough of them in one place. 31 eggs in that box alone. She already knew they were there. She had heard the particular sound of a well-occupied nesting box before she was close enough to see it. She knew the count before she counted. She held her hand against the wood for a moment, feeling the warmth of it. The cold of the tin crate slat had been one kind of knowledge. This was another kind. Both of them told the truth. The first one told her there was something still alive inside what looked finished. The second one told her what that something had become. She began to collect the eggs. She thought of Eli while she worked, not in the way she sometimes thought of him, which was the way you think of someone whose absence is a shape you keep navigating around, but in a different way. in the way you think of someone when something they would have wanted to see is right in front of you. He had been a careful man, not cautious, not slow, but careful in the sense of giving things the quality of attention they required, and not less. He would have stood in this barn and looked at these birds and known, the way Ruth knew, that the knowing had been in the checking, that you could not get to the 230 eggs on a given morning without having pressed your hand against the crate in the cold lot behind the auction shed and decided the warmth was worth $9 to find out about. Her father had given her the phrase. Eli had understood it without being told it, and she had carried it from the cellar where she first learned to candle eggs, through every difficult year of the farm. Through the night she had almost concluded something in the ledger that would have been wrong. Through the 4:30 mornings in the first winter after Eli's death, when she had been the only one in the barn, and the barn had felt very large. Through 23 mornings of empty nesting boxes, and a flock that was not yet doing what she knew it would do. Check before you conclude. Don't call it done because it looks dark. She had applied this to birds. She had applied it to ledger columns. She had applied it once to the farm itself, to the question of whether it could survive. And she had been right to check instead of conclude, and the farm had survived. She did not think of herself as a person who made a habit of being right. She thought of herself as a person who made a habit of checking, which was a different thing. Being right was the outcome. Checking was the practice. You could only control one of those. She finished collecting. She carried the eggs to the kitchen in the flat. She counted as she set them down, the way she always counted, row by row, 12 to a row. 228 eggs on a morning in the 8th week. The barn held 263 birds. The standing order in the ledger called for 60 dozen per week. The kitchen door neighbors would take what they always took on Wednesday and Friday. There would be eggs left. She put the kettle on. She opened the ledger. She wrote the number. There are stories that get told about people like Ruth Yoder. And in those stories, the important moment is usually the one where everything turns around. The flood of eggs. The buyer at the door. The neighbor who has to admit he was wrong. Those are real moments. And they happened, and they matter. But they are not where the story actually lives. The story lives in the 23 mornings of empty nesting boxes. In the 4:30 wake-ups when there was nothing to show for it, yet except 247 birds eating feed that cost money. In the ledger entry that was a number with no commentary, because the number was the commentary. In a woman pressing her palm flat against a wooden crate in a cold lot, and deciding that the warmth she felt was worth investigating before she concluded it wasn't there. What Ruth built in 8 weeks was not a miracle. It was the result of a $9 decision made correctly, followed by 8 weeks of decisions made carefully, followed by biology doing what biology does when the conditions are met. The conditions do not meet themselves. Someone has to do that part. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told what they have isn't worth the trouble. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever checked something everyone else had already written off, I want to hear what you found.